There's a theory that in the families of the second generation, that there is one son or daughter, usually the daughter, who they call the candle, who carries the light and wants to know and carry forward the experiences, and usually because they're passing it on to the next generation. My father was a Stalinist, communist and anti-Zionist, and so there was a lot of political conflict between my parents. He couldn't really deal with my mother's traumatic past. So she just didn't talk and kept it to herself. It was out of the blue. She just unprompted came out with this memory. I hadn't asked any questions. We were just at home chatting, and then suddenly her eyes slid sideways to the china cabinet, and she started to talk about the confiscation of the porcelain. And from then on, I realised that I could ask her questions because she'd volunteered the information. So we sat down together and recorded as much as I could get from her before it was too late, you know. And I wanted to get a feel for the topography of the home and the location. So I asked her if she could imagine for me entering the building from the street level and going up the stairs and entering the apartment, which she did very vividly for me. The texture of reality of the home came through, and that was very important to me. When she described the ring on the bell and the essay coming in with the tea chest, it wasn't the kind of cliched picture of brutal essay men. She said they were embarrassed, and they wrapped the porcelain up very carefully. You know, you would expect them to come in and start smashing things up, but I suppose because the porcelain was valuable, they wanted it to be wrapped up carefully so that somebody, you know, could have it. The delicacy of the wrapping with tissue paper of the porcelain figures, that the shepherd and the shepherdess and the Pierrot and the Pierrette, and the dismantling of this bourgeois, typically assimilated Jewish family life. There are many other stories of similar memories where you know, it was a much more brutal invasion. So in my mother's case, it was a shocking event, but it also had this sort of air of decorum about it, almost theatrical, almost like a ballet. The removal of these shepherd and the shepherdess from their glass cabinet and being wrapped in tissue paper, like, you know, which I did this. I made some clay models of figures, and I wrapped them in tissue paper just to see what they would look like. And of course they looked like shrouded figures, so the tissue paper became shrouds. Looking at the forms of the furnishings of the apartment that were removed, there's a description of this piano, and I imagined the piano being taken down the stairs. That was a kind of a very physical sort of imagining, because I thought about the men who had to carry this piano down the stairs, and how difficult that is to carry a large piano down the stairs. I wanted to know about the relationship between my grandparents, and I asked my mother when did she first realise that her parents were not happily married. I think I was interested in unhappy marriages because my parents' marriage was unhappy. And she recalled as a small child being at home playing under the table with her dolls, and her parents were in another room, and she could hear raised voices, and she could see her parents. They were not aware of her. She was, as children do, she was hiding under the table, behind the tablecloth, making a tent. And she saw her mother snatch her father's pocket watch, his gold pocket watch, from his waistcoat, throw it on the floor and stamp on it with her heel. This was a very shocking experience for a child, and I suppose you could call it a primal scene of awareness of, human relationships that she didn't know about, and that from that point on, she felt very protective towards her father and rather hostile towards her mother. And I started to speculate about the idea of a watch, a man's pocket watch, a gold pocket watch that he'd been given by his father, that it was a status symbol and it was a symbol of his masculinity, and that by stamping on the watch, my grandmother had sort of castrated him and humiliated him. And so it seemed a very symbolic act. And again, it seemed like a subject for a painting or a series of paintings. So I staged this in a small theatre in costume, and I wrote a little script, and they improvised very well. And this gave me the material for my series. And I liked the idea of turning it into a silhouette because that had a very German feel to it, and I was thinking of Lotte Reiniger and the idea of the silhouette being very typical of that period. I think her whole expectation of married life was shattered by history, by the hyperinflation, the depression, the unemployment, and she had been indulged. She had her own money, and during the time when my grandfather was a bankrupt, he had to take any employment that he could get, and he became a door-to-door salesman for fire extinguishers. And my mum remembered darning her father's socks because he would walk the streets with wearing holes in his shoes, while her mother was living the life of a bourgeois housewife and having her bridge parties and going to Baden-Baden and doing the things that she'd always done because she had her own money, and grandfather had to just try and do as best he could. The Wandervogel was a very important cultural phenomenon in Germany, and in those days before Hitler it was the Free German Youth Movement, and it was about self-expression and nature and anti-metropolitan spirit. It was also quite pantheistic and pagan in some ways, so it attracted people across a very wide range of interests. So you would have people like Walter Benjamin and Hermann Göring. You know, they were both members of the Wandervogel youth movement. Urban young people wanting to go out into nature. So they were city dwellers who, you know, put on their rucksacks and got on the tram and went out. It's called German Landscape with Wandervogel, and it was conceived as an allegorical landscape. I became interested in the idea of the path which could lead the German youth into fascism or not. The model is the railway station at the Grunewald forest, and this was the station where you go if you want to go to the forest, and you go through that archway. There's a kind of underground tunnel, and when you come out the other side, you're in the woods. It's a bit like a fairy tale. You're going, you know, like Alice going down the rabbit hole in a way. And the fact that there were these joyful memories about friends and happy times that started there. And then the sort of bitter irony of how it was used later. One of the stations where the Jews were taken in trucks to be boarded onto trains and then taken east. The painting is a family portrait, a posthumous family portrait, and it's a fabrication. I wanted to enter the room that was the place that they grew up in and had their family life in, and then became their prison. My grandmother and grandfather are seated, and my uncle Heinz is standing, and my mother is on the right. So my uncle Heinz would have been 19 when my mother left the family. The sponsors in England who gave my mother a refuge were willing to take him as well, but I guess the papers didn't arrive in time. When I think about the whole process, it's got this Freudian element of working through. So it's like the work of mourning, I suppose. But in my case, I'm mourning people that I had no direct knowledge of. I felt a compulsion to do it. It was very necessary to be done.